Welcome to Beyond the Classroom. In today's episode, we welcome Jennifer Beatty, Research Coordinator at the University of Pennsylvania, Wharton People Analytics. Welcome, Jen.
Hi, Diana. It's so great to be here.
Thank you for being here. Let's jump right in. You have undergraduate degrees in both theater and psychology, as well as master's degrees in education and applied positive psychology. Can you connect the dots for the viewers as to how did you end up where you are today?
Absolutely. So from the time I can remember, I've always wanted to help people. And I was fascinated by the human mind, right? Why do people do what they do? And from a very young age, I had this gift of being in front of people and performing. And so by the time I got to college, I was trying to connect those two fields and see how they could talk to each other, right? What can psychology teach us about performance, and what can performance teach us about the human mind? So I went in looking to study both, and it was an incredible experience in DC. And because it was more of a novel concept to put those two together at my university, I didn't really know how to craft a career from it. But I knew that the education that I had received, not just at college, but prior to that, had changed my life. And in my senior year, I was approached by a Teach for America recruiter that wanted me to consider, giving 2 years to urban education in the classroom. And once I talked more to them, I just realized that everything that had been given to me, I wanted to give back. And so I applied, was placed in Philadelphia. And when you're placed in Philadelphia, at the time that I did it, you go to the University of Pennsylvania to receive a master's in education. And so that got me started on that trajectory. And I always say I was a great teacher. I won awards, the students performed, but it wasn't my calling. And I always felt like there were other questions that I wanted to answer, particularly pertaining to the human mind, that I just couldn't address in the classroom. And so I went back to Penn to study applied positive psychology. And from there, the opportunities just opened up to me. And I began learning the nuances of research, and now I work as a research coordinator. And I'm really looking forward to crafting my own questions that I've observed my whole life to see if science can offer us some insights as to some of the social problems that we see.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so you and I met in San Antonio at a Dare to Lead facilitator training with Brene Brown.
Yes.
Tell me, what got you interested in Brene Brown's work and what led you to want to become certified?
So the first introduction I had was her book, The Gifts of Imperfection. And I actually found it, we call the Applied Positive Psychology program MAP. And when I was in the MAP program, I was working on a project that wanted to help high performers, they were musicians, deal with actually presenting themselves in front of the audience. So before they performed, they had to talk a little bit about what connected them to the work. And as soon as I read the problem, I said, I think I have something that might help with this. And I went to the gifts of imperfection, right? Because when we think of high performers, a lot of what goes into what makes people great are those, perfectionist tendencies. And I know myself because I'm a recovering perfectionist. And so, I read her 10 guideposts. I ended up presenting it in that classroom, and I got hooked. And I said, wow, the work that she's done collecting all of those 10,000 pieces of data to inform these theories is so poignant and so helpful that I, fell in love with it. And so when one of my cohort members actually went to the training earlier in the year, she called me after and she said, Jen, you got to do it. You got to do it. And she said, I know your research interests are in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they're looking for that too. You got to get on board.
Yes. And I'm so glad I did it too.
Yes.
For similar reasons, my interest was primarily how shame experiences shape a child's educational experience and how they then move on into the world carrying all of that shame.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the fact that most kids experience their first sense of shame or experience shame when they're in elementary school, and how that then shapes the kind of learner that they become, And then that leads into what kind of worker they become in the workforce. So that was really a big thing for me.
Wow.
And so on the same lines, also high performers, right? I deal with
Exactly.
many high performers in my job all over the place. I myself am a high performer, so
Yes.
I understand the perfectionistic tendencies. And I agree with you. I got completely hooked, and I was like, there is no way I am not going to this.
Yes.
You know? So.
And I think even just being able to name what it is when it comes up. So before she explained what shame was, I didn't have the words for it.
Right.
Right? Like I said, oh, I have experienced that. I didn't
Yes.
know to call it shame.
I don't think I knew to call it shame either, but it made so much sense when I read it.
Yeah.
And so part of our work as being Dare to Lead certified facilitators is that we bring Brené's work into organizations.
Absolutely.
The hallmark of that work is courage and vulnerability.
Yeah.
What role does courage and vulnerability play when you're talking about discrimination and bias?
Yeah, so, you don't get to courage without going through vulnerability. And I think when we approach these topics, they're so ingrained in us that we don't even know where to start. It's kind of like with shame, right? If we think about how we experience the world and how we show up in it, it's not in our DNA because I do think it's learned, but it's so in our environment, it's natural. And so in order to actually start grappling with it, you have to show up and say, I don't know how to deal with this.
Right.
I know that it's important. I know that it's pervasive, but I don't actually believe it's permanent. And I'm willing to not have the answers and to actually talk to people who may be suffering or may be experiencing or may have different experience than I am and show up and say, you know what? I can't control this, but I'm willing to engage. And I think that's the first step. And sometimes I always say showing up is like 75% of it because people don't show up as themselves, right? And say, Brené always talks about how we armor up. And sometimes people armor up with data. Sometimes people armor up with, I'm an expert in this, or I'm the leader of this. And to do this kind of work, you really can't show up like that, right? You have to show up as human to human and say, I have had a set of experiences that inform my perspective. You have a set of experience that inform your perspective. Let's meet side by side and talk about how this is showing up in our work, how we're either offloading or internalizing this pain, and let's actually move through it together as equals, not as someone who has all the answers.
Right, and I think it's an important distinction that you make that we get so wrapped up in our titles.
Yeah, oh
that
my
they
gosh.
actually end up holding us back from showing up as people.
Yes.
And so we always say, regardless of what field you're in, what position you hold within an organization, your job is people. That's your job.
It's so
and
good.
And when you connect on that, it
opens you up.
Yes, it does. Completely.
I love that. It reminds me of some of the work actually from, he was an educator, philosopher, Paulo Freire, and he talks about, the pedagogy of the oppressed. And he says, you're in a difficult power dynamic when you either believe one or two things, that you either have everything to teach or everything to learn. So if you are either playing the role of oppressor or oppressed, that we're not on even footing. Because in every situation, you have something to teach and you have something to learn. Right. And I think if we can come at it more balanced, we can actually hear each other and go forward.
Right. One of the quotes in my classroom is, I am both the teacher and the student.
I love that.
Because only when you are both on equal ground and coming from equal places can you get to where you need to go, the ultimate mission of growth and innovation.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about diversity. You mentioned diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Yeah. What do you think are the biggest challenges for people around diversity, inclusivity, and equity?
One of the things that I've actually come across more and more, just looking at the research in it, and this might be a little controversial to say, but time. People are always looking for the quick fixes, right? Well, can we just bring in this fix? Can we just bring in this expert? Can we just bring in this program? And it's like, we're asking to undo mindsets, behaviors, things that have built up over time. And, you know, one of the things that we learned even in Dare to Lead is that this stuff grows over time. And to really get under it, you need to, A, be open and vulnerable and willing to face it and show up, you know, as your whole self, flaws and all. And it doesn't always go as planned, right? Like, you can bring in the expert leader, but if everyone's not willing to show up and be themselves, you don't have the active ingredients to actually make a difference. And so sometimes I look at, you know, some trainings or some, you know, unconscious bias trainings, and it's like making people aware is the first step, but often we don't move beyond that. And I dream a dream, right, of an organization or an intention where we're not just doing this because we had a scandal, or we're not just doing this because, you know, there was a flurry in the news that this is important, but we look at what we have and we say, you know what? If we want to get to creativity, if we want to get to innovation, if we actually want to show up as something different than we've been doing the last 20, 40, 50 years, we need all voices in the room to know that they matter and that they're important. And the only way we do that is dedicating the time, the energy, the resources, and the effort. And, you know, a lot of things could get done with those things, but I think this in particular requires more than a quick fix.
I agree. And I think what's gotten us here in any given organization isn't what's going to get us to the next level.
Yeah.
And you know, there's things that just don't work anymore.
Yeah.
That we're kind of clinging or hanging on to instead of propelling ourselves forward.
Yeah, it reminds me of this quote too. You know, you have to let go of what you think you are to become what you were meant to be. Exactly. And I think when we get stuck in, well, we are this kind of company, or we are looking for culture fits. You know, one of the things that I love from some of the work I do is, you know, why do we want people to fit into the culture? Why not have culture disruptors, right? Why not have someone who says, yeah, I see that we've done it this way. I have an idea to do it differently, and actually welcome it in instead of shutting it down. Because if you don't try something different, you're never going to get something different. And people make themselves smaller to fit in. But we know from Brené's work, you know, belonging doesn't require you to change yourself. Belonging requires you to be yourself. And so if I can't be myself in a room, then I know that's a sign that equity, inclusion, diversity is not valued here. Because if I need to change to fit in, then all we're doing is creating these replicas of what we've already done.
Right, right. And I think about what you're saying, one of the biggest killers of innovation and creativity is when you hear in a meeting, but this is the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
And it's like, and there goes the energy. You know
Exactly.
what I mean? It's like a big zap, just gone. And you're like, oh, there it goes.
Yeah.
And so it makes so much sense to me that you've got to be yourself. And you do need culture disruptors. Yeah. What could you be learning about the culture from the disruptors that you're not willing to embrace?
Totally.
You know?
I think the other part too, the flip side to this is going back to courage and vulnerability, it takes a lot to show up as yourself. You know, I think of how often I hide because even if no one directly says it to me, I think, will I be accepted here? Am I enough? Should I say what I'm really thinking or what I think they want to hear? And those are the things that also get in the way. And also, people get tired of always having to explain or to share their perspective because everyone else thinks the same, and that happens to be different than how they think. And so I think it's a dance, right? Like, it's not just having the place set, but for people to show up, right, as themselves, take off the mask, take off the performance, be willing to risk failure, right? Be willing to fall, get up, fall again, right? Like all those things. I think some of the hardest courage isn't the first round courage. I call it like the second and the third round courage, right? Like you fell down and you're like, okay, I got to get back in there. And I know what it feels like to fall now, so it's going to be a lot harder for me to get back in.
Yes.
And then the third round, okay, I've fallen again, right? This isn't some victory march. It is relentless and it's really hard.
Yes, and you can walk away feeling very drained. You know, it gets
Yeah.
hard time after time when you're eating dirt and you're down on the ground, you know, you face planted maybe.
Yeah.
And now it's like, how do I get the strength? Where am I coming up? And that's the resilience piece of all this that we speak about in Brené's work, building resilience, building courage.
Yeah.
And so we always talk about, from the facilitation standpoint, we are courage builders.
Yes.
In an organization.
Absolutely. And to know that it's worth it. Too,
Yes.
right? Like, it's
Yes.
not just about the falling, because I guarantee when you get back up, yeah, your face might be a little bruised, you might have a little caked in dirt, but you are stronger and you're more expansive. Your perspective has changed. You're probably more empathetic to those who have fallen and might be struggling to get back up.
Yeah.
Like, it's so powerful.
It is very powerful work. And when we talk about organizational health, what are some of the core values that not only influence, but ultimately determine if an organization will thrive?
Yeah, it's such a nuanced question, right? Because so much goes into the thriving of an organization. But one of the things that I've learned, you know, studying organizational behavior and things like that, is to look at what people call like the culture influencers. So look at who everybody goes to and gets information and what is happening in those pockets, right? Are people gossiping? Are people back channeling where they have opinions, but they don't say them in the room, they say them out of the room? What's happening in the unobserved spaces? That's always a first kind of signal. And unfortunately, a lot of people who are in leadership positions aren't privy to that information because it's not happening, you know, in their faces, it's happening in the back doors. So if I were to go in and do like a culture assessment, I would say, you know, who does everyone talk to here? I'm thinking of some social psychology work called social reference, right? People who can influence their network, and they're not always necessarily the people who you think would influence, right? They're not always like the titled leaders or the people who have been there the longest, but they're the people who everyone seems to gravitate to. Because at the end of the day, people are the most invaluable resource of any company, period. It's not about the mission or the branding, because the people carry the message. The people are the ones who show you who you are and who you think you are, but you're not. So I always start with the people. But the second thing is I always like to see, you know, if you go in a meeting, who is everyone looking to? Because Brené talks about, you know, when you're in the arena, you have your season ticket holders. Oh, yeah. So it's like, who are the people hustling for? You know, who are those people in power that everyone's kind of looking for approval or affirmation? Because just looking at that power dynamic can be very indicative of the health of an organization, right? Does the leader let everyone else in the room speak first before the leader gives their opinion, knowing that whatever they say will shift the dynamic in the room? And so for me, it always comes back to people. So when I'm thinking of designing, testing, looking at interventions, it's like, you know, we can change other things and that can work. But I think culture starts with the humans.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it gets back to what we were saying before. Ultimately, your job is people.
Period.
Period. Done.
Yeah.
You can take your titles and put them aside. If you're not dealing with your people first, you can't lead humans.
No.
It just doesn't work.
Because the titles are also armor, right? Like, I know for me personally, I knew that I made growth when I stopped introducing myself by what I did, and I just started showing up and having conversations with people as who I am. Because I think we can all hide behind our credentials and what we do and all this. And, you know, I am right there with the best of them who can hide behind that stuff, right? So, and I think it's important to acknowledge when that gets in the way.
Right.
And when it matters for you to be the CEO or when it matters for you to be Bethany, right? And to say, okay, I struggle with this too. You know, it's hard for me to choose vulnerability over courage and, well, to get through courage through vulnerability. And sometimes I just want to be comfortable, right? And having those conversations authentically, I think can make a real difference.
I agree 100%. Let's talk for a second about emotional intelligence and soft skills.
Yeah.
A lot of people these days are like rolling their eyes and saying, well, that's a trendy catchphrase. But you and I both know that there's a lot of science behind this.
Totally.
what role does science play in social change, and how can it propel us forward into giving us more mental wellness in the workplace?
Yeah, so my first kind of real deep dive introduction to the science behind this was in the Applied Positive Psychology program, because one of the first thing we start with is the VIA classification of strengths. So you go in and you can take a personal, and it's similar to things like Gallup. So people are familiar with a strengths finder or strengths assessment. But the VIA in particular had a strength that's love, right? And even our leaders can show up and say, wow, I never knew that was something that I was uniquely bringing to my leadership. And seeing it as a strength and not a weakness or not something that gets in the way was the first step. But one of the things that I love about being a researcher and being a scientist is we can take actual questions, design ways to operationalize them. So what does this look like? How can we measure it? Test it. And sometimes you can test it in like laboratory settings, or real world settings are my favorite. They're messier, but you can really get some rich data there. And then say, what insights do we now know? Right? What can we responsibly say, this might contribute to this? And what can we say, we're consistently finding null effects over here. So maybe let's, test something else. And I think intuition is a strong starting place. And it's not about just accepting intuition. It's about testing your intuition, right? Like, I think this might be effective. Great. Let's go test it.
Right.
And I think they both play a strong role, right? I don't necessarily trust a scientist that doesn't have a strong gut and can know when to test something and also when to give up on something. That's very important as well. And I don't trust, an intuitionist who isn't willing to test some of the ideas that they hold dear. Because at the end of the day, we all bring our own perspectives. We all have our projects that we really, really care about and feel intimately connected with. But what science offers us is a way to validate it, a way to see it. Is this reliable? Is this testable? Is this something we should really be promoting to the masses? And I think it's important to do that due diligence before we spread it wide. Because humans matter, right? Like, we are affecting them every day.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'm just thinking about, I want to go back for a second with what you said about Teach for America.
Yeah.
So if you look at where you are today and you look at where you started with Teach for America, what are some of the concepts that you can take from your current position and turn around and say, I would love to see this in a classroom?
Man, a lot of the stuff I've learned about bias. Because I didn't know that everyone has it, right? Like, as a teacher, especially a young 22, fresh, bright-eyed, let's, help these kids. I didn't realize that even by calling them these kids, I'm showing up with my own bias, right? Already thinking that I have everything to offer them. And what can I really learn in this situation? And so I think, it's a catch-22, because at the same time I was teaching English, right, to 8th graders. I need to know how to teach English, right? And so all that being said, we have to balance what we need content-wise, but also what we need psychologically. And so even just introducing like an implicit bias training can help with things like referrals to the office, or even how we categorize troublemakers in the classroom. It's showing up, you're with those students more than you're with your family. And we, as humans, hold perceptions and biases in the classroom. And, we talk about the prison to, or the school to prison pipeline. All of it can go back to a teacher making a call. And I am, unashamed to admit that I made some calls in the classroom that I would have made differently, knowing what I know about implicit bias. But being 22, 23, you do the best you can, and it's our responsibility to make people more informed.
And I was just going to say, it doesn't matter whether you're 22 or 42 or
Yeah.
52. I think that when you know better, like Maya Angelou said,
do
when you know
better.
better, you do better.
Love that.
I've made terrible calls, if I'm being honest
Yeah.
with you. You don't have a 27-year career and look back on it and say, wow, I didn't screw that up. I think if you do have that kind of career, you didn't really live it.
Oh, that's good, Diana.
You really didn't live it, because it's the only way to move forward and learn how to
Yeah.
be different. So, one last question for you.
Yeah.
What's on the horizon for Jenn Beatty?
Oh my goodness. Well, talking about the science, I have fallen in love with research. And I am taking this balanced approach, right? Where I don't want to bury myself in a lab and not know how to apply these insights to the real world. And I want to be responsible in what I'm taking out to the real world. And so hopefully, for the next 5 to 7 years, we can develop some extended research on bias, discrimination, looking at what works with diversity, equity, inclusion in organizations, and then hopefully keep teaching, sharing, and learning with everyone.
What do you see? What do you foresee the future of workplace culture looking like?
I would love it if we could open ourselves up to understanding that these things take time and actually showing up and not just wanting to get to the bottom line of whatever success metric is at play, whether it's sales or, views or whatever it is, but actually saying, the people here matter and they spend most of their lives at work, just like most students spend most of their time at school. So let's make it someplace that's worthwhile, someplace where people feel welcome, where they belong, and not just to check off some requirement, but because it actually matters. That's what I foresee for the future.
And I love what you're saying about, let's make it an experience that people walk away from and look at as positive.
Yeah.
Even with an imperfect experience. It's not going to be a perfect experience, but let it be an experience nonetheless, that when you look back on it, whether it's your education or whether it's workplace culture, you view it as positive growth.
Yes.
For yourself and others.
So good. I agree with that. And I think it's possible. People sometimes can look at these ideas and say, oh, they're so audacious. How can they ever happen? But they happen by you taking one step toward that audacious goal and say, let's start with a lunch and learn.
Right.
Everyone, let's show up.
Right.
Start with a little programming and not give up when it gets tough, but to persist.
And so to connect the dots for everyone
Yeah.
here, if you were to be able to paint a picture of what you wanted your ideal future to look like, what would it look like?
It's such a great question. And I have realized that the things that I thought would happen in my life always end up looking very different than what I painted whenever I painted the picture. And so one of the things that I hope to carry with me are the values that I hold dear. And those are things like integrity, courage, choosing vulnerability, getting out of my comfort zone, and also helping people and living for something bigger than myself. And if I'm able to show up as myself with my work, then that'll be enough.
And we are going to see fantastic things on the horizon from Jenn Beatty. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Diana. It was a
Appreciate
pleasure.
your time. And that's all we have for today. This is Diana Ahl, reminding you to always take life's learnings beyond the classroom.